In the last episode, we learned how the succession struggle after Suleiman the Magnificent's death led to an influx of Anatolian Muslims into the Janissary core. What effect did this have? Did the Janissaries just carry on as before, or did this appearance of outsiders affect further changes? To answer these questions, we are going to have a look at the numbers around 1600. In order to understand the further development of the Janissaries, we have to look at the lifestyle forced on them in accordance with Janissary law. One point is the following. From time immemorial, it has been unlawful for Janissaries to marry. Only officers married and also private soldiers who were old and definitely unfit for service, and then only on application to the Sultan. The state of a Janissary is a state of celibacy, and for that reason barracks were built for them. Before we continue, I would like to add something totally different at this point. This quote made me think about barracks in general. I always considered them as a necessity, but the Janissary law made it clear to me that the point of barracks actually is the isolation of the soldiers. Now let us continue with maybe the most relevant change the influx of the new type of soldiers had onto the Janissary corps. Officers were allowed to marry, while among the common Janissaries only those old and unfit for service got permission. Now imagine an officer. In his institution he has at least some power, but under no circumstances he was allowed to utilize his privileges in favor of his children. Ottoman subjects could certainly make a living, but having a foothold in a household would guarantee change of status from an ordinary subject to a member of the ruling elite, with all the tax exemptions and other privileges it brought. Marriage also meant children, and it was natural that fathers who belonged to privileged groups should try to obtain the same privileges for their sons. In 1568, Selim II, after repeated demands, agreed to allow the Janissaries to enter the sons on the army payrolls as cadets. As boys they received rations and a small allowance, and were in due course enrolled as full members of the corps. This was a social order where somebody with an appointment certificate was deemed to have higher status than the richest merchant. The pressure for official employment inevitably reached the imperial palace itself. Judging by the careers of some such Turks reaching high office in the early decades of the 17th century, this practice must have already started in the 16th century. Selim's decision to allow Janissary sons into the corps was probably due to two factors. First, he had to provide some compensation for his peasant soldiery. Second, it could very well be that Selim II had to give in to the Janissaries' pressure. After all, he was only in the second year of his reign, and his way to becoming the heir was full of dead brothers. Furthermore, from all of his brothers he was the one the Janissaries preferred the least. The new right showed its effect soon. According to Yilmaz, in the early 17th century, around half of the Janissaries stationed in Istanbul were married. It was not that, in 1568, suddenly, every Janissary sent his son to the corps. It was a slow development which accelerated over time. Sons of Janissaries started being introduced into the corps, and the same was applied for young Muslims, adopted by Janissaries. Likewise, the Aga, head of the corps, was allowed to incorporate a number of protégés. In all these cases, entering the corps became a voluntary act. The Janissaries won further rights in 1582. Since then, they received the Sultan's general blessing to marry and take up a trade. The admittance of non-Devshirmes very often was connected to special occasions. In the same way, for the people who were admitted into the corps by the will of Murad III in 1582 on the occasion of the great circumcision feasts of his son Mehmed, this admission was a favor and by no means a requirement. With all these changes in the recruitment methods, Janissaries passed progressively from forced recruits to volunteers. We just learned a lot about the changes in recruitment in the second half of the 16th century. In the episode on the early numbers of the Janissaries, we investigated the correlation between recruitment and the military circumstances. Now let us do the same for this period in time. A good starting point is to look at what the existing Janissary thought about the extension of recruitment. The Ottoman elite of the time complained that Janissary positions were given to non-Devshirmes, such as Turks, Kurds, Gypsies and Persians, and that the system was being filled with outsiders. The Ottoman bureaucrats also listed the precautions that should be taken to prevent these distortions. That is, how to go back to the old regulations. However, they were unable to grasp the fact that to go back to the traditional system would have caused immediate devastation of the Ottoman army in the Central European battlefields. This reveals an internal conflict in the Janissary Corps. On the one hand, some pressured the Sultan to let their sons become Janissaries, while others advised against it and saw the changes as a dangerous corruption. But why should there be immediate devastation? The classical system of recruitment, tactics and warfare in general had been extremely successful and had produced a massive empire. The answer is the enemies of the Ottoman Empire. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman army reached the limits of its operational capabilities. Power relations on all fronts were more balanced, wars lasted longer, and they required commitments in fighting men, weaponry supplies and money at scales previously unseen. At least partly this was due to a series of wars on multiple fronts. From 1578 to 1590, the Ottomans waged war against the Safavids. The Safavids were a Persian dynasty. The war was at least in parts a religious struggle between the Muslim branches of Sunni and Shia Islam. It ended with massive victories for the Ottomans. Between 1593 and 1606 there was the long Turkish War between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. Overall, this war proved to be costly but useless for both sides. Furthermore, there was a multitude of big and small rebellions by the Celali in eastern Anatolia and Syria between 1595 to 1610. Celali was a preacher who declared himself Mahdi. After his revolts, many other revolts, no matter the actual grievances, got the same name. Those long-lasting wars obviously resulted in a high demand for a lot of manpower. Additionally, advancements in warfare techniques furthered the increase of the numbers of the Janissaries. Moreover, during the Hungarian Wars of 1593 to 1606, the Ottomans faced increased firepower from the musket-bearing Habsburg infantry, whose ratio to the cavalry in certain units reached 75%. The Ottomans strove to counterbalance this in two ways: by substantially increasing the number of musket-bearing Janissaries and by recruiting musketeers from the subject population. We can find out more about the task of the Habsburg infantry by looking at the equipment of the soldiers. More important, the musketeers and gunners usually outnumbered the pikemen 2 to 1, and as a result the imperial forces enjoyed firepower and tactical superiority over the Ottomans, a fact that contemporaries on both sides noted. So the newest military development in Europe was to employ as much firepower as possible. This was achieved by masses of musket-bearing infantrymen, as we have discussed extensively in the videos about Ottoman tactics and the Turkish bow. At the same time, the household troops of governors and non-temerariot provincial troops together accounted for more than 32% of the mobilized army. It was only with the help of such private and provincial troops that the Ottomans could still mobilize an army whose infantry to cavalry ratio was comparable to that of Istanbul's Habsburg and Romanov rivals. Still, more troops using gunpowder weapons were needed, and a lot of the new recruits ended up with the Janissaries. The Ottomans employed extensive usage of new early modern warfare techniques and a border fortress system during the Habsburg-Ottoman War of 1593 to 1606. This new warfare technology necessitated bigger armies, using firearms in the battlefield. The period of the early 1600s is characterized by intense recruitment of Muslims into the Janissary army, which was at this time transformed into being the main army. But it was not only the new fortresses and new tactics that increased the demand for manpower. The death rates were much higher too. In general, the multi-season wars of the late 16th and 17th century resulted in much higher rates of casualties and desertion than the wars of Suleiman. Combined, these multi-front, year-round wars created continuous demand for new recruits, both infantry and cavalry, that could not be met by traditional recruiting techniques and required new methods of mobilization. So the source where the Janissaries drew their replacements from slowly transformed. What did this mean for Devshirme? Aside from opening the Corps to new applicants, the recruiting practice of Devshirme changed too. Yilmaz provides data on the age of boys recruited through Devshirme. The first data point we have is from 1490. From this we can conclude that around 1500 the levy boys had an average age of 13.5 years. Overall the ages ranged between 12 and 15. In 1604 this had changed clearly. Now the Janissaries drafted boys up to the age of 20. This resulted in an average age of 16.5. In this case, the Devshirme decree explicitly ordered this age group. This data supports the idea that the intention of the changes in Devshirme was to provide more manpower to the military. Since a long training was not necessary for soldiers who just had to provide massed firepower, young boys were not very much in demand. In addition, when drafting older boys, more of them actually reached battle, as Yilmaz explains. One reason for seeking older boys was perhaps to reduce the number of casualties during conscription. The high risk of becoming sick during the transfer to Istanbul, the extreme work conditions of Acamies, and being more vulnerable to kidnapping might be additional reasons for the state to choose older boys during levies. We can take another point of view on the higher age of the recruits by remembering the training of Devshirmes from the classical period. Usually, after the selection they had to work at farms for some years in order to learn the Turkish language, gain strength and gather knowledge about Islam. This kind of training was introduced by Mehmed II, who reigned from 1432 to 1481. It seems this part of training was cut out since it became increasingly useless. Handing the new Janissary a gun and training him on it was enough. Furthermore, the new recruits already were Muslims and knew the Turkish language. Therefore, the training period was unnecessary and got cut from 6 years or more down to 1 or 2 years and finally was abolished altogether. It appears that this period staying among the Turks did not survive as long as the Devshirme system. It was no longer in force after the Devshirme campaigns of 1622 and 1636. Let us rethink this development. An early Janissary would spend years on training. In the end, he joined an elite force with a specific task in battle. He might even receive a good education and occupy important offices. In contrast, the new Janissary was all about committing cannon fodder to the front as quickly as possible. This may look like a loss of quality, but since we have already heard that the circumstances had changed, this is not a foregone conclusion. So, let us first listen to the voices complaining about the new recruitment practices. Kochub Bey, himself recruited by the Devshirme from Goritza in Macedonia, was deeply distressed at this degradation of the corps, and reminded the Sultan that he had no need to fill his armies with such riffraff. In Bosnia and Albania there are still men with brave and stout-hearted sons. This quote already presents a main motive of the critiques. Yilmaz presses this point further. The intellectuals who contributed to the genre of advice literature, however, were Devshirmes themselves, and their main issue was with the infiltration of the Muslim-born into their class. That a Devshirme would think this way is intuitively understandable. No matter if a boy experienced this draft euphorically or reluctantly, he was seen as someone special by society, and furthermore was trained to see himself that way. Whoever wrote this advice literature, he probably was a graduate from the Palace School. Maybe he was even a scholar and thereby really something special, because he achieved the social mobility about which scholars talked so much. But in the end, all the complaining of Janissaries who began their career through Devshirme was of no use. With so many candidates for household service, Devshirme was no longer needed. There were intermittent instances of it during the 17th century, but more as a result of calls for a return to the good old days before the time of troubles, exceptions that proved the observation that it had been in fact abandoned. The rapid increase in strength transformed the corps drastically. The main mode of recruitment, the Devshirme, had already lost its dominance with the relaxation of the non-marriage rule, and sons of Janissaries gained favored admission to the corps. Even though the Devshirme practice continued on until the middle of the 18th century, sons of Janissaries became the main source of manpower for the corps. Interestingly, even the availability of the sons did not fulfill the demand for soldiers, and the government had to recruit from other groups who had been seen as unreliable during the classical period. From time to time, volunteers under the name of Brother of the Corps were recruited with the promise of enrollment in the Janissary Corps if they served 3 years with distinction. Thus, the recruitment base moved from provinces to urban centers. So the changes in recruitment also had the effect that it changed the social origins of the soldiers. This will become very important in a later episode. For now, let's look at the time it took from allowing the first volunteers to getting rid of Devshirme altogether. Over time, Janissary political power grew. This led to a shift in 1568 toward allowing sons of older Janissaries into the corps, and from 1582 to permitting free men to enlist, so that by the start of the 17th century, the Janissaries were a mostly hereditary outfit. In 1594, the wealth and political power of the corps so attracted Muslim recruits eager for political advancement that the Devshirme system was effectively phased out, disappearing entirely by 1648. We have to recapitulate how fast this process was. In 1568, sons of Janissaries were allowed into the corps. At the start of the 16th century, after only 40 years, most positions in the corps were hereditary. Considering that under Sultan Suleiman in the middle of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire reached its peak, the total overhaul of the recruitment system in only 2 generations seems very quickly to me. I must add that 1648 for the end of Devshirme is not entirely correct. This probably was the point in time when Devshirme hardly ever was used anymore. Still, there were at least some tries to reinstate it. The levy of spoils, demanded by Sultan Ahmed III for the last time, increased in the years 1703 and 1705 without any result. In fact, ended at the end of the 17th century. To say Devshirme simply ended because it was demanded unsuccessfully is an understatement. As is known, the shield bearer had previously gone to the city of Naoussa to execute this exalted command and had undertaken the enrollment of the new Janissaries. At that time, the infidel inhabitants of the said city rebelled and said, "We are not giving up our sons to the Muslims," then dared to murder in public and in the midst of the Sultan's road the shield bearer and the 2 Muslims accompanying him. Finally, these infidel murderers, forming a band of 100 and more evildoers, raised the banner of rebellion. Now roaming the mountains and plains of the districts of Beroya and Naoussa, they have perpetrated and continue to perpetrate countless evils, that is to say, murders and robberies, at the expense of the Muslim faithful. So the last try to levy children through Devshirme was in 1705 in Naoussa, and it resulted in bloody murder. It goes without saying that such crimes could not go unpunished. Military forces came to the area. Some rebels were killed in battle and the survivors hanged. After that, their cut-off heads were paraded through the streets. Wow. This is how the Devshirme ended. That is a big thing. It seems that the people in the occupied areas were finally fed up with it. Let us look at the timeline. The Janissaries were instituted around 1370 through the recruitment of prisoners of war. In 1402, Devshirme was institutionalized and became more common during Murad II's reign after 1421. In 1568, sons of Janissaries were admitted into the corps. In 1582, the Sultan General allowed the Janissaries to marry and to take up a trade besides the military duties. And now we have learned that in 1648 Devshirme disappeared almost entirely. What kind of effect could this revolution in recruitment possibly have? These new Janissaries, the sons of slaves as they were called to distinguish them from the real slaves, were neither as carefully selected nor as rigorously trained as the products of the Devshirme. By 1592 they constituted the majority of the corps. And now we also see where the manpower for the tripling towards the end of the 16th century came from. First it was the sons of the Janissaries, and after that Turks and other Muslims joining the corps. And this is a good place to stop and take a look at what we learned today. The history of the Janissaries recruitment practice exposes a schema of military expansion. The original intention was to use prisoners of war as bodyguards. The next idea was to gather new recruits from occupied territories in the Balkans, since there was no real difference between a conquered people and prisoners of war. Why should this result in any problem? The empire was in desperate need for manpower anyways. After that, what should stop the Sultan from establishing this institution in Anatolia too, when the same thing was already done in the Balkans? Why should this result in any problems? The empire was in desperate need for manpower anyways. Then, when in Bosnia the population started to convert rapidly to Islam around 1500, there was a threat to lose good recruits. So in this area, the recruitment was extended to circumcised boys as long as they did not speak the Turkish language. Why should this result in any problem? The empire was in desperate need for manpower anyways. After that, allowing the natural and adopted sons of Devshirmes into the core surely could not hurt. The Sultan gave in to this demand of the Janissaries. Why should this result in any problem? The empire was in desperate need for manpower anyways. Finally, why not open the Janissary core for everyone who was willing, or unwilling for that matter, to join? Why should this result in any problem? The empire was in desperate need for manpower anyways. Although the older Janissaries, still raised traditionally through Devshirme, complained about this change, it was necessary from a military perspective. Towards the end of the 16th century, the manpower was needed for the wars against the Safavids in Persia and the Habsburg Empire. The death rates were higher and the armies relied more and more on masked musketeers. This explains the tripling of the numbers of the Janissary Corps. And now it's your turn again. Surely the changes in recruitment could not possibly go wrong. Or could they? What do you expect? Tell me in the comments. Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe. So long, we'll meet again soon. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free